My wife kicked me out after trusting her son's lies. 3 weeks later, she asked if I'd thought it over. I handed her divorce papers and her son exploded. Imagine watching your entire life, piece by piece, flying out of a second-story window. That was me, standing in my driveway, utterly blindsided, as my wife screamed for me to get out of her house. Her face was contorted with a rage I'd never witnessed, and yet, behind her, stood her 17-year-old son, Jake. His expression? A chilling mix of triumph and fake concern, a subtle smirk playing on his lips as his eyes met mine. Just that morning, we'd been sharing coffee, everything seemingly fine. But in this nightmare moment, everything had shattered. To understand how I ended up there, let me take you back. 4 years ago, I met Lauren. She was a beautiful, kind widow, managing a coffee shop, still grieving the loss of her husband to cancer 3 years prior. Her son, Jake, was just 13 then, a quiet kid, clearly lost without his father. I fell for Lauren hard and fast. 8 months later, I proposed, and she said yes, tears streaming down her face. I promised them both I'd never try to replace Jake's dad, but I'd always be there. The first 2 years of our marriage were, honestly, wonderful. Jake kept his distance, but I understood. I never pushed him to call me dad, I just offered support. I helped with homework, drove him around, paid for his phone, his clothes. I even bought us a bigger house so he'd have his own space. Lauren was happy, we were happy, and I truly believed Jake was adjusting. But looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment the poison started to drip into our lives. About 8 or 9 months ago, Jake began making these subtle comments to his mother. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and catch snippets, little things that sounded sweet on the surface, but carried an undeniable edge. He'd tell her how beautiful she was, how she deserved to be treated like a queen. At first, I thought he was just a kid complimenting his mom. Or he'd strategically bring up his deceased father whenever Lauren and I tried to set a boundary, claiming his dad would have let him do whatever he wanted. Initially, Lauren would shut him down, firmly telling him to stop, reminding him how good I was to them. But his comments kept coming, subtle and constant, like water slowly eroding stone. He started questioning why they had to follow my rules in what he called their house. I tried to talk to Lauren, suggesting Jake might be struggling to adjust, but she'd wave it off as typical teenage drama. Still, I caught her looking at me differently sometimes, a strange, searching gaze. Then, about 4 months ago, things got weirder. Jake became a completely different person depending on whether his mother was in the room. When Lauren was present, he'd be laughing, joking with me, acting like we were buddies. But the second she left, his face would go blank, completely neutral, as if I simply ceased to exist. I'd try to engage him, suggest activities, and he'd give me flat, one-word responses. Then Lauren would return, and he'd instantly become animated again. I started to feel crazy, like I was imagining the whole thing. The real explosion ignited 3 months ago when Jake asked me for a car. Not just any car, but a $35,000 BMW, just like his friend had. I sat him down, patiently explaining it was too much money, that we could find him a reliable used car for around $10,000, and he could get a part-time job to help with insurance. He stared at me like I'd slapped him, then stormed off to his room, where I could hear him sobbing dramatically. That night, Lauren was ice cold. She questioned whether it was really necessary to deny him, pointing out everything he'd been through, asking if it would kill me to give him this one thing. I was shocked. $35,000 for a teenager's first car was objectively insane. But she just turned away and said I didn't understand what it was like to be his mother. After that incident, everything changed, like a switch had been flipped. Jake started having whispered conversations with his mother that would abruptly halt whenever I entered the room. Lauren began questioning me out of nowhere, asking if I truly liked Jake, why he felt I was different when she wasn't around. I tried to defend myself, explaining I was the same person all the time, but she'd counter by asking why her son would lie. The fights became a regular occurrence. Jake would claim I'd said something harsh to him, and Lauren would confront me. Every time I tried to defend myself, she'd ask if I was calling her son a liar. I felt completely trapped. He was playing this perfectly, making vague accusations impossible to disprove, building a narrative of me as a two-faced abuser who only showed his true colors when we were alone. Then, 2 weeks before the clothes started flying, everything exploded in the worst possible way. I came home from work, and Lauren grabbed my arm, her voice shaking. "We need to talk about what happened with Jake," she said. My stomach plummeted. I had no idea what she was talking about. She pulled up Jake's sleeve, revealing a bruise on his forearm. Tears in her eyes, she told me he'd said I grabbed him, that I'd been getting aggressive when she wasn't home. My world tilted, and panic surged through me. I had never laid a hand on that kid. I was shouting now, desperate, but she recoiled from me as if I was dangerous. She told me she hadn't wanted to believe Jake, that for months she'd told herself he was just a dramatic teenager. But the things he'd been telling her were too specific, too consistent, to ignore. I grabbed her hands, begging her to think back, to remember if she'd ever seen me violent in our 4 years together. But she pulled away, saying that was what made it so scary, that Jake claimed I was like two different people. She told me to pack a bag and leave. Until she could figure things out and ensure her son was safe, I needed to get out. I packed with shaking hands, my mind reeling, trying to understand how my marriage had just imploded. As I loaded my car, I looked up one last time and saw them in the window. Jake had his arm around his mother, comforting her like a devoted son. But when he thought I couldn't see, he looked down at his phone and smiled. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a kid acting out. This was calculated. This was planned. As I drove to my brother's house, my entire life packed into trash bags in the backseat, one question hammered relentlessly in my mind: how long had the 17-year-old kid been planning to destroy my marriage? And more importantly, why? I spent the first week at my brother's in complete shock. Barely eating, barely sleeping, just replaying everything, every interaction, over and over. My brother, Dave, kept telling me to fight back, to call Lauren, to make her listen. But what was the point when she'd already decided I was the monster in this story? I must have called her 50 times that first week. Every call went straight to voicemail. I texted her, begging for a chance to talk, to explain, to show her that something was very wrong with Jake's story. She never responded. By the second week, the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by something cold and analytical. I started thinking about all those little moments over the past months, all those weird interactions that hadn't made sense at the time. Jake's performance on the stairs, that split second of curiosity before he put on his terrified act. It was too smooth, too practiced. The bruise on his arm had appeared at the perfect time, right after our biggest fight about the car. And those whispered conversations with his mother that stopped when I entered rooms, what had he been filling her head with all those months? I realized I needed help. Real, professional help. Because if Jake had been manipulating the situation this whole time, I needed proof. I called a lawyer first, a family law attorney named Patricia Chun, who came highly recommended. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking meticulous notes. When I finished, she looked at me seriously. "Do you own the house?" she asked. I told her yes, I'd bought it before the marriage with my own money. She nodded. "That's good. It gives you leverage. But we need to move quickly on the divorce paperwork if that's what you want." I told her I wasn't sure yet, that part of me still hoped Lauren would come to her senses. She gave me a sad smile. "In my experience," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "when someone chooses to believe the worst about you without evidence, they've already made their choice." That hit me hard, but I knew she was right. Then I hired a private investigator, a guy named Marcus, who specialized in infidelity and fraud cases. I felt ridiculous at first, like I was being paranoid, but I told him everything, about Jake's behavior, the manipulation, the lies. Marcus didn't seem surprised at all. He told me he'd seen cases like this before, kids who manipulated parents during divorces or blended family situations. Teenagers can be incredibly sophisticated manipulators when they want something, he said. "Let me look into the finances first." See if there's a money trail, because there usually is. It took Marcus less than a week to find the first bombshell. Our joint account, the one Lauren and I had set up for household expenses and savings, had been bleeding money for almost 6 months. $8,000 in total, withdrawn in increments small enough that I hadn't noticed while I was working 60-hour weeks. The charges were for gaming equipment, expensive clothes, electronics, DoorDash orders, sometimes twice a day. All of it tied back to Jake. But here's what made my blood run cold: Lauren had to have known. Several of the charges required parental approval, and there were bank statements showing she'd transferred money from our savings to cover the overdrafts Jake had created. She'd been actively hiding it from me, covering for him, probably because she knew I'd say no to that kind of frivolous spending. Marcus found something else, too. He pulled our credit report and discovered Lauren had applied for a credit card in just her name 2 months ago, right around the time Jake's campaign against me had intensified. She'd maxed it out almost immediately, another $4,000, mostly on stuff for Jake. When Marcus showed me the evidence, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This wasn't just about Jake manipulating his mother. Lauren had been actively deceiving me, too, choosing her son over our marriage and our financial future. But the real gold mine came when Marcus suggested we look into Jake's social media and digital footprint. He had a contact who could access deleted messages and posts, all perfectly legal with the right tools. I gave him the go-ahead, even though it felt invasive, because I desperately needed to know the truth. What we found was devastating. Messages between Jake and his friends going back almost a year talked openly about his plan. "My mom's starting to doubt him," one message read. "Just got to push a little harder and the old man's gone." In another conversation, Jake literally wrote out his strategy. "Mom always believes me when I cry. It's so easy," he told his friend Tyler. There were messages about the car, too, about how I was a cheap bastard who didn't understand that Jake deserved nice things. But the worst message, the one that made everything crystal clear, was from 3 weeks ago, right before everything exploded. "Almost there," Jake had written. "Got the bruise ready. Going to show Mom tonight. This should be the final nail in the coffin." He had planned a bruise. He deliberately hurt himself to frame me. Marcus found a video, too, hidden in Jake's cloud storage, probably recorded by accident. It showed Jake in his bathroom, slamming his own forearm against the edge of the counter, wincing, but doing it again and again until a dark bruise formed. "This better work," he muttered to himself in the video. I sat there watching the 17-year-old kid abuse himself to destroy my marriage, and I felt physically sick. Why? Why would someone do this? What had I done to deserve this level of calculated cruelty? Then Marcus showed me the final piece of the puzzle. Messages between Jake and his best friend about their plan for after the divorce. "Once they split, Mom will want to leave this boring town," Jake wrote. "She'll sell the house and we can finally move to the city where everything actually happens. Plus, without him around, she'll have more money to spend on me." It was all about money and location. Jake wanted a different life, a more exciting life in the city where his friends had moved, and I was the obstacle. The house was in my name, so Lauren couldn't sell it while we were married. But if we divorced, Jake figured she'd want a fresh start somewhere else, and he'd finally get what he wanted. I had everything. The financial fraud, the manipulative messages, the video of him creating the bruise, all of it. Patricia Chun looked over everything and told me this was more than enough for a divorce with a very favorable settlement. But she warned me that exposing Jake's manipulation might damage my relationship with Lauren permanently. I almost laughed. What relationship? The woman had thrown me out based on lies without even giving me a chance to defend myself. That night, 3 weeks after she'd kicked me out, I finally got a text from Lauren. "Have you had time to think about your behavior?" it read. "Jake says he's willing to give you another chance if you apologize to him and commit to doing better. We can talk about you coming home if you've really reflected on what you've done." I stared at that message for a long time. She wasn't asking if I was okay. She wasn't apologizing for not hearing my side. She was demanding I apologize to the kid who'd orchestrated this entire nightmare. I texted back just 4 words, "Come over tomorrow, 3 p.m. She responded immediately, "Does this mean you're ready to make things right?" I didn't answer. Instead, I spent the rest of the night organizing all the evidence into a folder, printing out the messages, the bank statements, everything. Tomorrow, Lauren was going to learn the truth about her son, and our marriage was going to end. There was no comin' back from this. Lauren arrived at the coffee shop at exactly 3 p.m., and I watched her through the window as she parked. She looked tired, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of the love I'd once had for her. But then I remembered the past 3 weeks of silence, the accusations, the way she'd chosen to believe the worst of me without question. She walked toward the entrance with an expression on her face, half hopeful and half nervous, probably expecting me to be broken and apologetic. I'd chosen this coffee shop deliberately because it was neutral territory, a public place where neither of us had the advantage, and I wanted witnesses for what was about to happen. She spotted me at a corner table in the back and made her way over, sliding into the seat across from me with a cautious smile. The coffee shop was busy enough that we had privacy, but not so empty that we were alone, and I positioned myself so I could see the parking lot through the window. She started talking almost immediately about how she and Jake had been discussing things, how maybe if I was willing to go to therapy and work on my anger issues, we could find a way forward. I let her talk for about 30 seconds before I held up my hand to stop her. Then, I slid a large manila folder across the small table. She looked at it, confused, then back at me with questions in her eyes. "Open it," I told her, my voice flat and emotionless. She hesitated, then picked up the folder with shaking hands. The first thing she saw was the divorce paperwork, official and already signed by my lawyer. Her face went white, and she looked up at me with genuine shock, starting to say, "We could work through this." I just told her to keep looking. She flipped through the pages, and I watched her face change as she saw the bank statements, the credit card bills, the highlighted charges that showed $8,000 of our money spent by Jake. She tried to explain, but I cut her off and told her to keep going. Then she got to the printed messages. Jake's conversations with his friends, where he'd laid out his entire manipulation strategy. I saw the exact moment she read the words her son had written about how easy it was to make her believe him, how the old man would be gone soon. Her hands started trembling, and she kept shaking her head like she could deny what was right in front of her. She whispered that it couldn't be real, that these could be fake. That's when I pulled out my phone and played the video, the volume low enough that only she could hear. Jake's voice came through clearly as he slammed his own arm against the bathroom counter, over and over, creating the bruise he'd shown his mother. Lauren's face crumbled. She dropped the papers onto the table, her hand clamped over her mouth. She was mumbling about how he'd told her I grabbed him, how he'd cried and seemed so scared. I interrupted her. "He played you," I explained coldly. "For months, he systematically destroyed our marriage because he wanted you to sell my house and move to the city with him. It's all right there in the messages." She was sobbing now, trying to keep quiet in the public space, her whole body shaking as she tried to process that her son had orchestrated this entire nightmare. Then she asked why I hadn't made her see, why I hadn't told her. That question broke something inside me. I told her I had tried, that I'd begged her to talk to me, but she'd chosen to believe Jake without evidence, without even asking for my side of the story. She'd thrown me out of my own house based on lies. She reached across the table for my hand, but I pulled back. She said desperately that she was protecting her child, asking what she was supposed to do. "You were supposed to be my wife," I said, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself and remembered where we were. "You were supposed to give me the benefit of the doubt after 4 years of marriage." The words that came next were ones I'd been holding in for 3 weeks. I told her she was supposed to ask questions, demand proof, something, but she didn't. Because deep down, she'd already chosen Jake over me. The truth hung in the air between us, painful and undeniable. She'd made her choice weeks ago, maybe even months ago when Jake's whispered poison had first started working on her, and I was just the collateral damage. That's when the coffee shop door opened with a force, and Jake walked in. He'd been waiting in the car outside and apparently couldn't stand not knowing what was happening. He spotted us immediately and stormed over to our table, his face red with anger, demanding to know what I was doing to his mom. Then he saw the papers scattered on the table, and his expression changed. For just a second, I saw real fear before he tried to recover, telling his mother that whatever I was saying was a lie, that I was trying to turn her against him. I picked up my phone and turned the screen toward him, showing him his own video of creating the bruise. His face went through a rapid series of emotions, shock, panic, then finally settling on anger. He said loudly that I'd gone through his stuff, that I had no right, and people in the coffee shop were starting to look at us. I kept my voice calm. "You framed me for abuse," I told him. "So I had every right." Lauren was staring at her son like she'd never seen him before, her voice breaking as she begged him to tell her it wasn't real, that he didn't do this. And that's when Jake's mask finally came off completely. "So what if I did?" he said, his voice getting louder and drawing even more attention. He said she was miserable with me anyway, that I was boring and cheap and not his dad, that they should have left this stupid town a year ago. Lauren gasped like she'd been physically struck, her eyes darting around at the other customers who were now openly staring. Jake kept going, seemingly not caring about the audience, saying he did what he had to do because all his friends had moved to the city and he was stuck here because of me. He told his mother she deserved better than this boring life, that they both did, and once she divorced me and sold the house, they could finally have a real life. I interrupted quietly to remind him that it was my house, and Lauren couldn't sell it. His face went even redder, and he started talking about lawsuits and how his friend's mom had gotten half of everything in her divorce. That's when I saw the moment Lauren finally understood what her son had become, right there in the middle of a crowded coffee shop. She whispered that he destroyed her marriage for money and a change of location, that he'd made her believe her husband was abusing him so they could move to be near his friends. Jake tried to backtrack, suddenly aware of all the people watching, stammering that it wasn't like that he just wanted them to be happy together. I cut through all of it and told them both the reality of their situation. I explained firmly but quietly that they had 30 days to find a new place, as stated in the divorce papers. After that, I was taking back my house. Lauren looked at me with such raw devastation in her eyes and begged for time, to process this, to fix what had been broken. But I was done. I told her there was nothing to fix. That she'd chosen to believe I was a monster without evidence. That she'd let her son manipulate her for months and never once questioned it. Even now, knowing the truth, she was asking me for another chance. But the painful reality was that she'd never given me a first chance. She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands while Jake stood there with his arms crossed, looking defiant and angry, even though his entire scheme had collapsed around him. I watched them, this mother and son who destroyed my trust and my marriage, and felt nothing but emptiness where love used to be. I stood up from the table, gathered my copy of the divorce papers, and told them I was leaving. I repeated that they had 30 days to move out of my house. Lauren tried to grab my arm, but I pulled away gently and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Lauren's sobs and Jake starting to argue with her, his voice rising again as he probably tried to spin this somehow. I walked out of that coffee shop and got in my car. And through the window, I could see them still at the table, Lauren with her head in her hands, crying, while Jake gestured angrily, probably still blaming me for everything, even as the evidence of his manipulation sat right there in front of them. Ending reflective resolution. A month later, my lawyer called to confirm they'd moved out on time. They'd found a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, nothing like the spacious house they'd left behind. Patricia mentioned that Lauren had tried to fight for some financial settlement, but had no legal ground to stand on since the house was mine before the marriage, and she'd been complicit in the theft of $8,000. My brother Dave told me, through mutual friends, that Lauren was devastated, barely functioning at work, and that Jake was making her life miserable by blaming her for not moving faster, for not selling the house somehow, for ruining his plan. Their relationship was apparently strained to the breaking point, with Jake treating her with the same manipulative contempt he'd shown me. Part of me felt sad about it sometimes, late at night when my house was too quiet, and I'd remember the good times before Jake's poison had taken root. But mostly, I felt relief, like I'd dodged a bullet that would have eventually destroyed me completely. You can't build a marriage with someone who doesn't trust you. And you can't love someone who will throw you away the moment it becomes convenient. I'd learned the hardest lesson of my life, one that cost me 4 years in a marriage I'd thought would last forever. Trust without communication isn't real trust, it's just blind faith. And blind faith without evidence or questions is dangerous. Jake had taught me that lesson in the cruelest way possible. And now, both he and Lauren were living with the consequences of the lies they'd chosen to believe, and the loyalty they'd chosen wrong. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever had your trust shattered like this, or witnessed manipulation so cunning? Share your thoughts below. I'm genuinely curious to hear what you all think.